Hello there. Tonight we are going to drift into the marble-lit world of ancient Rome, right into the silk-draped chambers and shadowy corridors of absolute power. The air is thick with incense and whispers. Somewhere nearby, a senator plots in silence. A servant slips poison into a goblet. The emperor gazes from his balcony, staring down at a city that belongs entirely to him and somehow still wants more. It all sounds rather glamorous until you realize you probably won't survive 5 minutes. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. Feel free to comment with where you're listening from and what time it is in your part of the world. I love knowing who's drifting off with me tonight. Now turn off the lights, maybe turn on the fan for some soothing noise, and let's get started tonight. The story begins not with an emperor, but with a knife. It's 44 BC, and Julius Caesar, the man who refused to call himself king while behaving very much like one has just been stabbed to death by a bunch of senators wearing togas and guilty consciences. Rome is in chaos. The Republic is bleeding, and from the ashes steps a young man no one expects to survive the week. Gaius Octavius is barely 18, pale, sickly, bookish. He is Caesar's grandnephew, and as it turns out, Caesar's adopted son. By Roman law, that makes him heir. But to what exactly? A republic full of angry nobles, a bankrupt state, a population used to bread circuses, and blood. Historians still debate whether Octavian's genius was natural or cultivated, but either way, it kicks in fast. He joins forces with two unlikely allies, Mark Antony, Caesar's right-hand man with a flair for drunken drama, and Lepidus, who history mostly forgets. Together they form the Second Triumvirate and go on a murderous spree of political enemies, crossing names off a list like they're settling restaurant tabs. And it works for a while. Eventually the alliance frays. Lepidus is quietly exiled, and Octavian goes to war against Antony and Cleopatra. Their epic showdown at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC ends with Cleopatra's barge fleeing the scene and Antony literally falling on his sword. With that, Octavian becomes the sole ruler of Rome. But here's where it gets interesting. He doesn't declare himself king. Oh no, he's too smart for that. Instead, he takes on the title Princeps First Citizen. He pretends he's just restoring the Republic, just cleaning up the place, just here to help. Meanwhile, he holds all the power, all of it. He controls the army, the treasury, the laws, the Senate grovels, the people cheer. And so with absolute power disguised as humble service, the Roman Empire is born. He becomes Augustus. In 27 BC, a title that practically hums with divine glow. He reshapes Rome into a glittering capital, builds roads, aqueducts, temples. Statues of him pop up like pop stars. Coins show him looking calm, ageless, benevolent, very godlike, very curated. The kind of man who definitely wouldn't murder his political rivals in secret. The Pax Romana, or Roman peace, begins under his reign. For over 2 decades, the empire enjoys an age of relative calm and prosperity. Poets like Virgil compose epic odes about how wonderful it all is. The arts flourish, the provinces quiet down. On paper, Augustus is a genius statesman. But behind the temple columns, it's a mess. Augustus's personal life reads like a Greek tragedy crossed with a high society tabloid. He suffers heartbreak after heartbreak. His beloved nephew Marcellus dies young. His stepsons Gaius and Lucius, groomed for leadership, both perish mysteriously. Historians still debate whether illness, accident, or quiet poison removed them, but the pattern is clear. No heir seems to survive him. Then there's his daughter Julia. She's witty, brilliant, politically astute, and far too wild for Roman conservative taste. Her affairs become public knowledge. Augustus, branding himself the savior of Roman morals, is mortified. He exiles her to a barren island and never sees her again. Meanwhile, looming in the background is Tiberius. Augustus' stepson by marriage. Tiberius is dutiful, competent, and deeply unpleasant. Augustus clearly doesn't like him, but with no other options, he adopts him and makes him heir. The end of Augustus' reign is tinged with regret and fatigue. The dream of restoring the Republic has long faded, replaced by the reality of dynastic succession. He dies in 14 AD, possibly whispering that he found Rome a city of bricks and left it a city of marble. Or maybe that was just the PR team. Either way, the godlike mask slips off. Underneath it was a man who built an empire out of ruins and made it look effortless. He also set the stage for centuries of emperors, many of whom would wear the purple robes with far less grace. And so the first curtain falls. Just behind it waits a man on an island surrounded by sycophant swimmers and statues of sea monsters. Tiberius had never wanted to be emperor. He preferred quiet villas to bustling forums, deep shadows to center stage, and military command to political theater. And yet, when Augustus took his final breath, it was Tiberius who inherited the empire, not with a fanfare of joy, but with a kind of heavy inevitability. Born into the privileged Claudian clan, Tiberius was a soldier, not a showman. He had marched with his legions in Germania and Pannonia, brooding beneath his helmet and earning the grudging respect of his men. He was tall, pale with cold eyes, and a personality that repelled warmth like oil on water. Even his own mother, the infamous Livia, seemed to love him more as a project than a son. Historians still debate whether Tiberius's reign began with promise or doom, but most agree it began with reluctance. At the age of 55, ancient by Roman standards, he stepped into Augustus's marble sandals, inheriting not just a vast empire, but also a suffocating legacy. The Senate played their part in the dance, pretending to beg him to accept power, and Tiberius pretended to hesitate. He accepted in the end, of course. They always do. The early years weren't terrible. Tiberius was efficient, even admirable, in his administrative restraint. He didn't waste money on absurd projects. He kept the provinces orderly. He didn't pick fights with foreign kings just to hear the sound of trumpets. But he was no Augustus. If Augustus ruled like a charismatic cult leader with a genius for optics, Tiberius governed like a resentful landlord. He communicated with the Senate through curt letters. He avoided public events, and he began spending more and more time far from Rome until eventually he left altogether. The island of Capri became his sanctuary, or depending on who you ask, his lair. There, perched above the sea in a villa of marble halls and looming cliffs, Tiberius slowly unraveled. The people of Rome whispered about what happened on Capri parties with young boys, obscene rituals, dark obsessions. One source, the biographer Suetonius, painted Capri as a nightmare of perversion and paranoia. Others suggest these stories were exaggerated by political enemies or later historians with a taste for scandal. Either way, one truth is clear. Tiberius became increasingly isolated and untrusting. He installed a network of informants across Rome, encouraging citizens to accuse one another of treason. Once accused, the accused rarely walked free. The empire became a stage for suspicion, with senators unsure if their dinner guest might be a government spy. A wrong word at a banquet could mean exile. A joke about the emperor might lead to a forced suicide. You can almost imagine Tiberius sitting on a marble bench surrounded by servants and statues, scanning reports with sunken eyes and muttering, "They all want me dead." And yet, for all this, Rome still functioned. That's the strange thing about Tiberius. Even as he rotted away on his pleasure island, the empire kept humming along. Grain arrived, roads were built, the army stayed loyal. But the succession problem, yes, that old Roman curse was brewing once again. Tiberius had a natural son, Drusus the Younger, who might have inherited the throne. But Drusus died suddenly, perhaps poisoned, perhaps not. Historians still argue about it. That left Tiberius with a grandnephew, Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus. You know him as Caligula. But before we go there, we need to talk about one Sejanus. Lucius Aelius Sejanus was the head of the Praetorian Guard, the emperor's elite bodyguard, and unofficial palace enforcers. Sejanus was ambitious, charismatic, and dangerously intelligent, the kind of man who smiled while moving chess pieces no one else saw. While Tiberius sulked on Capri, Sejanus ran the show in Rome. He purged rivals, charmed the Senate, and even dared to seek marriage into the imperial family. Some believe he hoped to become emperor himself. For a time, he was untouchable. And then just like that, he wasn't. In 31 AD, Tiberius sent a letter to the Senate accusing Sejanus of treason. The senators who'd once groveled before him turned with savage speed. Sejanus was arrested mid-speech, dragged off, and executed. His body was thrown down the Gemonian stairs where it was left to rot. His family and friends were purged. Babies were strangled. It was one of those moments when the facade of Roman civilization peeled back, and you saw the ancient city for what it really was, a machine that ground people into dust. After Sejanus, Tiberius became worse, if that's possible. He trusted no one. He let the empire slip into the hands of minor bureaucrats. The letters he sent to the Senate grew colder. The treason trials ramped up. He appointed Caligula and his grandson, Gemellus, as joint heirs, but showed no real warmth to either. When Tiberius finally died in 37 AD, at the age of 77, rumors flew like startled doves. Some said he'd been smothered with a pillow by Caligula himself. Others said he simply stopped breathing, and then started again only to be smothered by a nervous servant. No one knows for sure. The one thing everyone agreed on: no one mourned him. The Senate debated whether to damn his memory, but ultimately refrained. Rome moved on. It always did. And Caligula, that golden-haired child of Germanicus, stepped into the limelight with the sparkle of destiny in his eyes. At first it was like the sun had come out. He opened the prisons, he gave bonuses to the soldiers, he threw festivals and games and spectacles. People cried in the streets. At last they said a real Caesar, a true son of Rome. But if they had looked more closely, they might have seen it the flicker behind his eyes. The way he watched people a little too long. The way his smile stayed too still. Historians still debate whether Caligula's madness was sudden or always there waiting. But it didn't take long to find out. The man who replaced Tiberius would not just rule Rome, he would make it dance, bleed, and laugh at its own destruction. That's next. But for now, let the image linger: Tiberius alone in his villa, peering out at the endless blue sea, convinced that Rome was a city of knives aimed always inward. And one of them, one very specific smiling one, was already sharpening. When Gaius Julius Caesar Germanicus, better known by his childhood nickname Caligula, stepped into power, Rome exhaled. After the long, joyless reign of Tiberius, the people were desperate for a fresh start, and what could be more promising than the son of the beloved General Germanicus, the boy who had grown up among soldiers, the boy they called Caligula, after the little soldier boots, Caligae, he wore toddling through army camps. He was young, handsome, charismatic. The crowds adored him, the Senate welcomed him, the army saluted him. For the first 6 months, things were downright cheerful. Caligula abolished unpopular taxes. He recalled exiles, including the ashes of his mother and brothers whom Tiberius had destroyed. He staged games, festivals, and races. He wept publicly during his first speech to the people, claiming he would be a ruler for all Romans, not just the elites. And then something happened. Historians still debate exactly what. Some say it was a severe illness that struck him down in the autumn of his first year. Others suggest it was poison. Still others believe the rot had always been there, hiding under that angelic smile, and the illness simply let it out. Whatever it was, when Caligula recovered, he was different. Gone was the golden boy. In his place stood a man who believed he was a god, not figuratively, literally. He began appearing in public dressed as Apollo or Hercules, sometimes as Mercury, sometimes as Venus. His favorite outfit, a golden beard, lion skin, and club classic Hercules cosplay. The Senate squirmed. The people whispered, but he wasn't just playing dress-up. He demanded worship. Temples were erected. Statues were altered to carry his face. He referred to himself as a living deity. Visitors from the east were expected to prostrate themselves in his presence. When one dignitary refused, Caligula reportedly asked if he thought he was standing before a mere mortal or Jupiter himself. And that was the least weird part. The stories of his reign blur the line between history and hallucination. Whether they're entirely true or wildly exaggerated, they reveal the terrifying reputation Caligula built for himself in only 4 short years. Let's start with the horse. Yes, the horse. Caligula was obsessed with his prized steed Incitatus. The horse had a marble stall, an ivory manger, a purple blanket, and a collar of precious stones. He was fed oats mixed with gold flakes. Caligula invited him to dinner parties and reportedly swore to make him consul, one of the highest positions in Roman government. Historians still debate whether this was a real political statement or just an elaborate equine inside joke. Either way, it didn't go over well with the Senate. But that was just a warm-up. Caligula soon stopped pretending to care about tradition. He flaunted his power, his desires, and his cruelty with a kind of gleeful abandon. He seduced the wives of senators sometimes during dinner and then described the details at dessert. He allegedly forced fathers to witness the execution of their sons and then scolded them if they didn't applaud the efficiency. His sense of humor was, shall we say, unique. Once during a public execution, he ordered the crowd to stay. When it started raining and people tried to leave, he had the gates locked and declared that all should stay, whether they liked it or not. Another time, when asked to pardon a prisoner, he paused theatrically and said, "Fine, let them all live." Then as the crowd began to cheer, he added, "No, wait, strike that. Kill them all," just to watch the joy turn to horror. He loved playing God with real consequences. At one point, he led a military campaign to the shores of Gaul. His soldiers waited for a battle that never came. Instead, Caligula declared war on the sea itself. He ordered his men to gather seashells as spoils of war against Neptune, god of the ocean. They did. Because he told them to. His paranoia grew, his cruelty escalated, his inner circle shrank. He began executing senators left and right, sometimes for reasons so petty they weren't even recorded. He wandered the palace at night cloaked and barefoot, practicing his expressions in mirrors and whispering to statues. He dreamed of replacing the head of Jupiter's statue with his own likeness. And then there were his sisters. He had 3 Drusilla Livilla and Agrippina the Younger. He adored Drusilla most of all, too much according to some ancient sources. Rumors spread that their relationship was unnatural. When Drusilla died unexpectedly in 38 AD, Caligula was shattered. He banned all public entertainment, declared her a goddess, and never truly recovered. Soon Rome was terrified. People walked on eggshells. The Praetorian Guard, his own bodyguards, began to mutter. Even the most loyal advisors were shaken. And then one day in 41 AD it happened. Caligula was walking through a narrow corridor beneath the imperial palace when a group of conspirators surrounded him. The first blow struck his neck. The others followed. When it was over, Caligula's body was riddled with wounds, stabbed over 30 times. His wife and daughter were also murdered. His golden empire built on excess and blood had collapsed in a flash of daggers. The Senate rejoiced. Some wanted to restore the Republic, but the Praetorian Guard had other plans. As the dust settled, they found a man hiding behind a curtain. He was middle-aged, limping, stuttering. Everyone thought he was a fool, a scholarly relic of the imperial family who'd survived by pretending to be harmless. His name was Claudius, and the guard, perhaps out of boredom or strategy or sheer whimsy, declared him emperor. That's how Rome worked. One moment you're hiding behind furniture, the next you're ruler of the world. And Claudius would surprise them all. But let's not rush. Let's let Caligula's image linger a bit longer. The boy emperor with a boyish grin who rose to power on a wave of adoration and rode it straight into madness. The man who ordered the sea to surrender, who held Rome in one hand and a seashell in the other. Sleepy empires always fall the same way, not with logic, but with laughter dread and a whisper behind the curtain. And Claudius, he heard it too. Claudius had spent most of his life being overlooked, and he was very, very good at it. He stammered. He limped. He drooled when he got excited. His head twitched. His knees knocked. In the cutthroat world of imperial Rome, that was as good as wearing a sign that said, "Ignore me, I'm harmless." It worked. While his relatives schemed, poisoned, plotted, and perished, Claudius kept his nose buried in scrolls. He was the family embarrassment, the punchline at dinner parties. At best, they thought him simple. At worst, cursed by the gods, and for that reason alone, he survived. And now somehow he was emperor. When the Praetorian Guard dragged him out from behind the curtain where he'd been shaking in terror after Caligula's assassination, He thought he was about to be executed. Instead, they saluted, and in a moment that could only happen. In Rome, Claudius went from last surviving joke of the Julio-Claudian clan to the most powerful man in the world. It was 41 AD. The Senate was horrified, but Rome was curious. Could this trembling scholar actually rule? Oh yes, he could. Once crowned, Claudius wasted no time proving everyone wrong. He surrounded himself with capable administrators. He dove into the work with the eagerness of a man who'd spent his whole life preparing for a test no one thought he'd take. And he passed. He expanded the empire, launching the conquest of Britain, an audacious campaign no emperor had dared since Julius Caesar's time. He improved the legal system, hearing thousands of cases personally. He reformed the grain supply. He built aqueducts, harbors, roads, practical things, the kind people actually needed. It turns out Claudius was not just competent, he was brilliant. He wrote dozens of books. He knew history, law, and languages. He proposed reforming the Latin alphabet. No one listened. Historians still debate whether his additions were visionary or completely bonkers. But for all his intellect and energy, Claudius had one tragic blind spot: his wives. And oh, the drama they brought. His first 3 marriages didn't end well, and then came wife number 4, Valeria Messalina. Messalina was beautiful, young, and according to nearly every ancient source, completely unhinged. She used her position as empress to accumulate wealth, favor, and most notoriously lovers, dozens of them, maybe hundreds. She'd arrange secret rendezvous inside the palace, sometimes not so secret. The gossip in Rome swirled like perfume in a banquet hall, but then she went too far. In 48 AD, while Claudius was away, Messalina staged what could only be described as a fake wedding. She publicly married one of her lovers, a senator named Gaius Silius, in what some historians say was an attempted coup. Others think it was just whatever the ancient Roman version of a reality show breakdown looks like. When word reached Claudius, he blinked, stammered, and finally snapped. He ordered her execution. When the soldiers hesitated, she tried to stab herself and failed, so they did it for her. Claudius was devastated for about 5 minutes. Then he did what any lonely widower with absolute power might do. He married his niece. Agrippina the Younger was many things. Beautiful, ruthless, calculating. And she came with a son from a previous marriage, a solemn-faced, musically inclined teenager named Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus. We'll get to him. For now, know that Agrippina didn't marry Claudius for love. She married him to place her son on the throne, and she played the game like a master. She seduced Claudius, won over the court, and persuaded him to adopt young Lucius, now renamed Nero, as his official heir, pushing aside Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus. It was a bloodless coup at first. Then in 54 AD, Claudius sat down to a plate of mushrooms. Delicious imperial mushrooms. You can probably guess what happened next. Ancient historians like to claim Agrippina slipped poison into her husband's favorite dish, possibly laced with a corrective dose by a complicit physician, when Claudius started vomiting it back up. Whether true or not, historians still debate the specifics. Claudius died that night. Some say his final words were a joke. "Oh dear, I think I'm becoming a god." It would have been fitting. Romans had a habit of deifying their dead emperors no matter how embarrassing they'd been in life. And now Nero, just 16 years old, stood at the helm of the empire, guided by his mother's cold, careful hands. But before we get to his flaming fiddles and golden palaces, let's linger a moment with Claudius. He never wanted to rule. No one thought he could, but he did. For 13 years, he outlasted the poisoners, the plotters, and the senators who rolled their eyes behind his back. He expanded the empire. He gave Rome clean water. He made the world a little more efficient, a little more stable. And then he died, staring up at a ceiling fresco with the bitter taste of mushrooms on his tongue. There's something profoundly human about Claudius. A man ignored for his disabilities, underestimated for his awkwardness, and mourned eventually for his unexpected greatness. He was proof that sometimes the best rulers are the ones you least expect. His legacy, a competent, practical empire. His curse, Nero. Because as Claudius's body cooled and Rome lit its funeral pyres, a new emperor was crowned. A boy with dreams of lyres and stages. A boy whose mother had orchestrated murder to put him here. A boy who would burn brighter and darker than almost anyone before him. But not just yet. For now the golden laurel rested lightly on Nero's brow. His skin was smooth, his voice trained, his smile practiced, and somewhere behind the colonnades Agrippina was watching, carefully. After all, the empire was hers, at least. For now. When Nero stepped onto the imperial stage at just 16 years old, Rome wasn't sure what to expect. He had the bloodline adopted by Claudius' great-great-grandson of Augustus himself, and he had the look youthful, fair-skinned, with wide-set eyes and a pout that always seemed on the verge of delivering a dramatic monologue. But Nero didn't enter alone. For the first few years of his reign, the real power behind the scenes was his mother, Agrippina the Younger, the same Agrippina who may or may not have fed her husband poisonous mushrooms and who had already secured the throne for her son by muscling aside every rival in her path. At first it worked beautifully. Agrippina ran the palace like a command center. Nero's tutors, particularly the Stoic philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, helped maintain stability. The Senate was relieved. The people adored him. The coins bore his image next to his mother's, rare, even scandalous in Roman eyes. For a moment, Rome had something it hadn't seen in a while: optimism. But Nero had other ideas. He wasn't interested in policy or conquest or administration. What Nero really wanted was applause. He fancied himself an artist, a poet, a musician, a performer. He played the lyre and sang in elaborate concerts. He forced the upper classes to attend his recitals, locking the doors so no one could leave. It was said that some women gave birth during his performances, and that some men faked their deaths just to escape. Historians still debate whether Nero's talents were truly awful or merely unbearable by Roman elite standards, but either way he took them very, very seriously. And this growing obsession with his own image began to wear on his handlers, especially Agrippina. At first, she tried to control him. She made demands. She scolded. She reminded him loudly and often that he owed everything to her. Nero didn't like that. He started to push back. First, he distanced her from the imperial court. Then her portraits disappeared from coins. Then her guards and advisors were reassigned or quietly dismissed. When she objected, Nero arranged for her to be invited onto a special boat. It was beautifully decorated, a private cruise, and rigged to collapse. Agrippina, however, was made of sterner stuff. When the sabotage failed and the ship didn't kill her, she swam to shore, exhausted, furious, and very much alive. Nero panicked. He sent assassins. They stabbed her in her villa. One account claims that her final words when she saw the dagger raised were, "Strike the womb that bore Nero." Poetic maybe, but probably invented. With Agrippina out of the way, Nero was free to indulge. And indulge he did. He married multiple times. He executed his rivals, including his own stepbrother, Britannicus, who suddenly dropped dead during a banquet after drinking from the wrong cup. Nero barely blinked. The boy had become inconvenient. Meanwhile, the empire ticked on, and then in the summer of 64 AD the fire began. It started in the merchant districts where narrow alleys and wooden tenements turned the city into a tinderbox. The flames spread quickly, fanned by the wind and the poor firefighting systems. For 9 days, Rome burned. People fled to the riverbanks. Temples collapsed. The skyline glowed red. It was a disaster unlike anything the capital had seen. And where was Nero? According to some accounts, he was watching the fire from a tower, singing about the fall of Troy, while strumming his lyre in a costume of flowing silk. This gave rise to the famous legend Nero fiddled while Rome burned. Of course, fiddles didn't exist yet, and the story may be propaganda. Historians still debate whether Nero actually started the fire or whether he used it as an opportunity. But one thing is clear: after the ashes cooled, he seized swaths of cleared land and began construction on his greatest fantasy, the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. It was a sprawling pleasure palace with gold-leafed walls, rotating banquet halls, fountains of wine, and a colossal statue of himself towering over the city like a bronze god. Ordinary Romans who had lost everything were unimpressed. To deflect blame for the fire, Nero found a convenient scapegoat, a small, suspicious new religious sect known as the Christians. They were arrested by the hundreds. Some were crucified. Others were coated in pitch and burned alive to light Nero's nighttime garden parties. It was the first major imperial persecution of Christians, and it would not be the last. At this point, Nero's reign began to spiral. He killed his wives. Poppaea Sabina, pregnant at the time, was kicked to death in a fit of rage. He later had her embalmed with exotic spices and publicly mourned her between musical performances. He then married a young boy who resembled her, castrated him, and paraded him around dressed as his dead wife. Yes, that happened. The Senate was horrified. The military grumbled. Even the people once enchanted by his theatrics grew wary. Then came rebellion. In 68 AD, the governor of Gaul Gaius, Julius Vindex, rose up against Nero's taxes. He was crushed by another general, Galba, who was then proclaimed emperor by his own troops. As support for Nero collapsed, he fled Rome. Abandoned by the Senate and declared a public enemy, Nero hid in a suburban villa, trembling indecisive. When the soldiers came for him, he ordered his secretary to help him end it. His final words before a blade pierced his throat were reportedly, "What an artist dies in me." With that, the Julio-Claudian dynasty died too. The curtain fell on the boy emperor who wanted to be adored, not obeyed, who saw Rome as a stage, its people as audience, and its power as a performance. His story was part opera, part tragedy, and all cautionary tale. He ruled for 14 years, and he left behind a city that still smoldered culturally, emotionally, and literally. But the real fire that came next. With Nero dead, the empire had no heir, no plan, no structure. And so began one of the wildest years in Roman history. They called it the Year of the Four Emperors. And yes, it's as chaotic as it sounds. We'll get there. But first, close your eyes. Let your mind drift through Nero's marble halls, past gold ceilings and peacocks in gardens, over silver fountains and echoing lyres. The music is fading, the torchlight is gone, and somewhere in the darkness Rome is holding its breath, waiting to see who dares to claim the purple next. The Roman Empire, once held in place by Augustus's cunning and Nero's chaos, now dangled above a void. The year was 69 AD. The Julio-Claudian dynasty was gone. Nero had fled, weeping and whining, into history, and with his death, the question that had haunted Rome for generations finally erupted into full-blown crisis. Who gets to be emperor when there are no rules? Apparently, everyone. What followed became known as the Year of the Four Emperors, an absurdly dangerous game of imperial musical chairs where the prize was a crumbling empire and the penalty for losing was almost always death. First up, Servius Sulpicius Galba, an old, stern senator with a spine of marble and the charm of one, too. He had once served Augustus and ruled Spain for Nero, but when Nero fell, Galba's soldiers hailed him as the new emperor. The Senate, desperate for stability, agreed. Galba marched into Rome like a man entering a retirement villa, not realizing the job had changed drastically since the last time he'd read the description. He cut bonuses to the Praetorian Guard. Big mistake. See, the Guard had gotten used to being bribed for their loyalty. They didn't appreciate the new emperor acting like it was the Republic again. Galba, proudly proclaiming that he chose soldiers, not bought them, quickly discovered what happens when you stop paying people who carry swords for a living. The Guard turned on him. Within 7 months of taking power, Galba was hacked to death in the Roman Forum, his head displayed on a pike after being kicked around by passing citizens like a bloody football. You know, for morale. Enter Emperor number 2, Marcus Salvius Otho. Otho had been a drinking buddy of Nero, complete with matching extravagance and flair. He had hoped Galba would name him heir. When that didn't happen, Otho bribed the Praetorian Guard, organized a coup, and took the throne. Rome sighed again, maybe this one would last. Spoiler, he didn't. Far away in Germania, another general, Aulus Vitellius, had already been declared emperor by his legions. Word of Otho's coronation only made Vitellius more determined. He began a slow, methodical march toward Rome, stopping only for banquets and elaborate buffets. We'll get to that. Back in Rome, Otho made a surprising decision. He didn't wait to defend the city. He marched north to confront Vitellius in person, leading his troops like a good Roman general of old. At the Battle of Bedricum, Otho's forces were crushed. Rather than throw the empire into another round of civil war, Otho fell on his sword literally. He wrote a calm farewell letter and died with what the ancients called dignitas. His reign had lasted just over 3 months. So naturally, Vitellius became emperor. Emperor number 3 reporting for duty. Vitellius was something else. A glutton. A gambler. A man who once bankrupted an entire treasury for a single banquet. His breakfasts were bigger than most weddings. He dined 4 times a day and vomited between meals to make room. His shoes were encrusted with gems. His sense of restraint was non-existent. He celebrated Otho's death by marching into Rome with great fanfare and promptly purged everyone he thought might disagree with him. But while Vitellius was busy devouring oysters and silencing senators, trouble was brewing in the east. Titus Flavius Vespasianus Vespasian was a no-nonsense general currently fighting the Jewish revolt in Judea. He had the loyalty of the eastern legions, the grain supply of Egypt, and the patience of a man who'd seen it all. When his troops declared him emperor, he didn't argue. He just got to work. While his son Titus continued the siege of Jerusalem, Vespasian sent trusted commanders westward. They crossed the sea, rallied support, and prepared to take Rome. The Flavian forces met Vitellius's army at a second battle of Bedriacum, yes, another one, and crushed them. Rome descended into street fighting. Vitellius panicked, tried to resign. Then he changed his mind. Then he tried to flee dressed as a humble priest. Unfortunately for him, even the gods couldn't save him now. He was captured by Vespasian's troops, dragged through the streets, tortured, and tossed into the Tiber River like yesterday's fish stew. And with that, Vespasian, Emperor Semaphore, entered the city. He didn't arrive immediately. He sent his son Domitian to represent the family while he tied up loose ends in Egypt. But once he took the throne, the tone shifted. Gone were the feast and chaos. Gone were the golden cloaks and musical evenings. In their place stood a tired soldier, broad-shouldered and squinting at the mess he'd inherited. He wasn't interested in theatrics. He was interested in repairs. The empire, after this blood-soaked roller coaster of a year, needed someone who could balance a budget and reinforce an aqueduct. And Vespasian did exactly that. He reformed the tax system. He punished corruption. He restored discipline in the legions. He even taxed public urinals. Yes, you heard that right. And when people complained, he'd hold up a coin and say, "Pecunia non olet." Money doesn't stink. Vespasian's most enduring legacy, though, would be made of stone, the Colosseum. He began construction on the Flavian Amphitheater using the ruins of Nero's palace complex as raw material. Where the Domus Aurea had once stood, Nero's grand gold-leafed vanity project Rome would now have a public arena, a symbol of unity, bread and circuses for the people. And in a poetic twist, many of the stones used to build it came from the spoils of the Jewish revolt. You'll see a hint of that if you ever stand under the Arch of Titus, which still commemorates the conquest to this day. Vespasian ruled for 10 years, dying peacefully in his bed, an almost miraculous feat for a Roman emperor. His final words, "Dear me, I think I'm becoming a god," a dry jab at the Roman custom of deifying dead emperors. But before we say goodbye to this whirlwind year, take a breath. Close your eyes and picture it. 4 emperors in a single year. Swords clashing under torchlight, gold coins melting in banquet fires, old generals becoming kings, and all of it happening beneath the same Roman sky. The empire had teetered on the edge, stared into the abyss, and somehow clawed its way back. But peace is always temporary in Rome. And Vespasian's sons, well, they had different ideas about what a ruler should be. One wanted to be remembered. The other worshipped. One died too soon. The other too late. We'll start with the golden child next. Titus the Conqueror of Jerusalem, the man who tried to be good, and then we'll meet his brother, Domitian, the man who stabbed flies with a styler, and saw assassins in every shadow. When Emperor Vespasian passed away in 79 AD, the empire held its breath again, but this time there was no civil war, no pretenders, no coup, no river-bloated bodies. For once, succession went exactly as planned. His eldest son Titus stepped into power not with daggers or bribes, but with open arms. It felt odd, almost suspiciously smooth for Rome. Titus Flavius Vespasianus had already earned his reputation long before wearing the purple. He'd crushed the Jewish revolt in Judea, famously sacking Jerusalem, and with it the Second Temple. Roman propaganda painted him as a conquering hero. Jewish sources remembered him less fondly. The Arch of Titus, which still stands today, depicts the spoils carried back to Rome, the menorah, the trumpet, the sacred vessels etched forever in marble relief. At home, though, Titus was a bit of a paradox. He was charming, educated, and popular. He was also rumored to have a volatile temper and a serious weakness for luxury. While serving under his father, he'd earned some gossip column heat for his affair with Berenice, a Jewish princess who showed up in Rome dressed like Cleopatra Tuto. Senators were scandalized. Even the people grumbled. To his credit, when he took the throne, Titus sent her away. Sometimes you have to choose the empire over love. But Rome wasn't finished testing him. In his first year as emperor, Vesuvius exploded. The eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 AD, just months into Titus's reign, was apocalyptic. The cities of Pompeii and Herculaneum, bustling seaside towns full of taverns, theaters, bathhouses, and vineyards, were buried under volcanic ash and pumice. Thousands perished, their final moments frozen in time. And Titus. He rushed aid to the survivors. He funneled emergency funds. He personally visited the region to oversee relief efforts. The people were stunned. An emperor. Who cared? But fate wasn't done. The next year, Rome was hit by a massive fire that raged for 3 days, destroying key buildings, including parts of the Capitoline Temple and the Pantheon. Again, Titus responded swiftly. He dipped into the treasury, rebuilt what was lost, and kept spirits high. And then in 81 AD, just 2 years into his reign, Titus fell ill. The cause is still unknown. Fever-poisoned historians debate it, of course, but within days he was dead. He was only 41. On his deathbed, he whispered, "I have made but one mistake." What mistake he didn't say. Naturally, that's all historians needed to write entire books speculating what he meant. Was it sending away Berenice? Was it trusting his younger brother? Ah yes, his brother. Enter Domitian. Domitian had waited in the wings for years, sullen, resentful, and painfully aware of his place in the family. He wasn't the conqueror. He wasn't the golden boy. He was the spare, the younger son, overshadowed. Until now, when Titus died, Domitian didn't wait for Senate approval. He declared himself emperor at once, possibly before his brother even stopped breathing. And with that, Rome got a new ruler. Domitian was complicated. To the public, he played the part well. He finished the Colosseum. He handed out generous games and spectacles. He paid soldiers well. He built temples, repaired roads, and bolstered the empire's borders. In the provinces, people generally liked him. In Rome, not so much. He quickly abandoned the cooperative style of his father and brother. Domitian demanded total control. He insisted on being called Dominus et Deus, Master and God. He exiled or executed senators who spoke out. He filled the palace with mirrors and polished moonstone to spot potential assassins approaching from behind. He also had a peculiar hobby, killing flies. According to Suetonius, Domitian would sit alone in his study, stabbing flies with a stylus and lining them up like trophies. One day, a visitor asked if anyone else was inside. A servant answered dryly, "No, not even a fly." He spent his nights wandering the halls, sweating, paranoid, whispering names. He maintained a list of people to be executed. It was updated often. But for all his cruelty, Domitian was also efficient, like a terrifying office manager. He cracked down on corruption. He revalued the coinage to strengthen the currency. He repaired the empire's finances after decades of excess. He launched campaigns in Britain and along the Danube that actually held the borders. And yet, Rome seethed, the Senate despised him. The aristocracy feared him. Even his inner circle started watching their backs. By the late 80s, AD Domitian was increasingly isolated. He trusted no one. He tortured suspected conspirators. He grew obsessed with omens and astrology. He had his cousin executed. He may have even executed the man who interpreted his dreams. You know, just in case. Eventually, even his wife got fed up. In 96 AD, a conspiracy was formed, possibly including his chamberlain, court officials, and yes, possibly his wife Domitia. One evening, a servant distracted the guards. Domitian was stabbed in his chambers. His body was cremated without ceremony. The Senate, thrilled, immediately declared his memory damnatio memoriae, condemned. Statues were smashed, inscriptions erased, coins melted. It was as if Rome collectively whispered, "Let's pretend that never happened." But memory, like marble dust, lingers in the cracks. And so Domitian's story closes not with war or public revolt, but a knife in the dark and a quick scrub of the historical record. In his place, the Senate installed an old man, an old senator, a compromise candidate, a bridge to something new. His name was Nerva. He had no army, no sons, no illusions, but what he did have was a plan, because the empire couldn't take another man who thought he was a god. It needed someone who could choose what came next. Someone worthy. That moment when an emperor picked his successor not by blood but by merit would change everything. But we'll get there. First, let the curtain close on the Flavian dynasty. 3 emperors, 1 father, 2 sons. One built the Colosseum, one soothed a burning city, and one lined up flies on a desk like secrets too dangerous to speak aloud. Rome endured them all. And now the next chapter waited quietly, cautiously on the other side of an old man's trembling hand. By the time Nerva took the throne in 96 AD, Rome was exhausted. Assassinations, purges, coups, tyrants, fires, and fly-stabbing paranoia had left the empire dazed like a boxer still on their feet, but wobbling on the ropes. So, when the Senate hastily proclaimed this mild-mannered elder statesman as the new emperor, no one cheered wildly or composed flattering poems. They just exhaled. Marcus Cocceius Nerva was about as unflashy as emperors come. He was nearly 70. He had no military background, no surviving children, and absolutely no taste for theatrics. He had spent his life quietly climbing the ranks of Roman bureaucracy under previous emperors, keeping his head down while everyone else's rolled. And that perhaps was his greatest qualification. He wasn't Domitian. He immediately set to work undoing the worst of his predecessor's legacy. He freed political prisoners. He recalled exiles. He stopped treason trials and returned confiscated property. Statues of Domitian were hauled down from pedestals, sometimes literally kicked through the streets by delighted mobs. Still, there was a problem. Nerva had no army at his back. And in Rome, that was like ruling with no pants on. The Praetorian Guard, who had helped stab Domitian in the first place, now began testing the old man's resolve. They didn't trust him. They didn't fear him. When Nerva refused to punish the assassins of Domitian harshly enough, the Guard revolted, storming the palace and taking Nerva hostage. Imagine it, an emperor locked in his own palace, humiliated, powerless. He survived barely, but he knew it wouldn't happen again. So he made the single most important decision of his short reign. He adopted a successor, not a relative, not a puppet, a soldier. Trajan. Marcus Ulpius Traianus was everything Nerva wasn't. Tall, commanding, beloved by the legions, the governor of Germania, known for a discipline, loyalty, and a general don't-mess-with-me energy. Nerva didn't just name him heir, he publicly adopted him as his son. It was the political version of saying, you don't have to like me, but wait till my kid gets here. And it worked. The military calmed. The Senate sighed in relief. Nerva died peacefully in 98 AD after just 16 months in power. He was the first emperor to adopt a successor by merit, not blood. It wouldn't be the last, and Trajan would become known as the best emperor Rome ever had. No pressure. From the moment he took the purple Trajan brought a jolt of energy to the empire. He was a man of action, and he had a to-do list. 1. Expand the empire. 2. Fill the treasury. 3. Build big flashy stuff. 4. Make Rome proud again. First came the military campaigns. His most famous conquests were in Dacia, modern-day Romania, where rich gold mines promised to refill Rome's depleted coffers. The wars were brutal, but Trajan didn't play subtle. He invaded twice, crushed the resistance, and returned to Rome in triumph, his pockets jingling. With Dacia annexed and gold pouring in, he celebrated the only way a Roman emperor knew how, by building monuments. He constructed a new forum, Trajan's Forum, featuring markets, basilicas, and libraries. And towering above it all was Trajan's Column, a 100-foot marble spiral carved with scenes from the Dacian Wars like a giant graphic novel in stone. You can still see it today, every battle bridge and beard immortalized in sculpted detail. But Trajan wasn't just about swords and marble. He introduced welfare programs known as the Alimenta to support orphaned and poor children. He improved roads and aqueducts. He lowered taxes in provinces hit by disaster. He respected the Senate. He walked among the people. He gave Rome something it hadn't had in a long time, a ruler who actually felt Roman. And then, in 113 AD, he decided it was time for one last grand adventure. He turned his gaze eastward toward the Parthian Empire. The Parthians were the great rival to Rome, horse-riding, bow-shooting warriors who had once humiliated Crassus and kept the eastern border hot for decades. Trajan wanted to settle things once and for all. He crossed into Mesopotamia and conquered Armenia. He captured the Parthian capital of Ctesiphon. He pushed further than any Roman emperor ever had, reaching the Persian Gulf. It was breathtaking. It was also a bit much. His supply lines were stretched, his troops were tired, rebellions were flaring up behind him, and then his health began to fail. He started coughing, sweating. He couldn't sleep. He had to turn back. In 117 AD, on the journey home, he collapsed in the city of Selinus. He died there likely of a stroke or heart failure at the age of 63. But Trajan, ever the planner, had already prepared for this. Before his death, he had adopted his cousin's son, Publius Aelius Hadrianus. Hadrian. Rome was about to get a very different kind of emperor. Where Trajan was a warrior, Hadrian was a wanderer. Where Trajan built monuments to victory, Hadrian built walls of caution. Where Trajan expanded, Hadrian consolidated. And oh, how he traveled. Hadrian spent more than half his reign outside Italy, personally inspecting every corner of the empire. He sailed to Egypt, hiked through Syria, camped with troops in Britain, debated philosophers in Athens. No emperor had ever seen so much of the empire he ruled. In Britain, he ordered the construction of a wall, a long stone barrier stretching across the island to mark the edge of Roman territory. Hadrian's Wall. It's cold today. You can still walk it. You'll find sheep and wind and the ghosts of Roman centuries. But Hadrian was more than just a builder of barriers. He loved Greek culture, spoke the language fluently, wore a beard which was odd for Romans at the time. He admired art, poetry, architecture. He wrote his own verses. He built grand villas and serene gardens. His villa at Tivoli was a sprawling wonderland of fountains, colonnades, and exotic sculptures. And then there was Antinous. Hadrian met the beautiful young Greek in Bithynia. The two became inseparable. Whether their relationship was romantic, spiritual, or both is still debated, but when Antinous died mysteriously during a trip to Egypt, Hadrian was shattered. He mourned extravagantly. He deified the boy, founded a city in his name, minted coins, built temples. Rome blinked uncomfortably but said nothing. Emperors could do that. Later in life, Hadrian grew more reclusive, bitter, possibly ill. He quarreled with senators, executed close allies, tried unsuccessfully to kill himself. But before death claimed him in 138 AD, he adopted yet another successor, Antoninus Pius, on one condition: that he adopt Hadrian's own choice to follow Marcus Aurelius. That's right, we're now adopting emperors like nesting dolls. But the result was extraordinary, because next came 20 years of quiet governance, of economic stability, of peace. Antoninus Pius ruled from his villa, rarely left Italy, never led a campaign, but under his gentle touch, the empire flourished. And after him, Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher king, took the reins. We'll meet him soon. But tonight, let this chapter rest, with Trajan's armies marching east with Hadrian's footsteps, tracing the empire's borders, and with quiet Antoninus tending to Rome like a careful gardener. For once there was no fire, no murder, just the hum of an empire breathing steady under the stars. It wouldn't last, but for now sleep comes easily. The emperor is watching the sky, and writing poems in the dark. Marcus Aurelius had the kind of resume that makes modern overachievers want to close their laptops and lie down. Philosopher, soldier, emperor, stoic, husband, father, and at the end of it all, one of the most mourned rulers in Roman history. But if he hoped to reign in peace, the gods had other plans. When Antoninus Pius died in 161 AD, Marcus Aurelius was already in his 40s. Calm, contemplative, and deeply principled, he had trained his whole life for this moment, not by leading armies or holding gladiator games, but by studying philosophy, ethics, and governance. The Stoics had taught him that emotions should not rule men, that virtue is the highest good, that the universe is change and life is opinion. Great advice until your empire starts falling apart. Let's start with the first problem family, Instead of ruling alone, Marcus chose to share the imperial throne with his adoptive brother and close friend Lucius Verus. It was meant to be a symbolic partnership, two emperors for a balanced Rome. But Lucius was more interested in hunting, drinking, and showing off his golden hair than actually governing. Historians sometimes refer to him as the co-emperor who partied while Marcus read. Still, their alliance worked for a while. Then the Antonine Plague arrived. It swept through the empire like a ghost with a cold breath, probably smallpox or measles introduced by returning soldiers from the east. Entire cities emptied out. Armies withered. Farmers died in their fields. The population plummeted. Lucius caught the disease and died in 169 AD, leaving Marcus to carry the empire alone. Next came the northern frontiers. The Marcomannic Wars weren't glamorous. They were muddy, grueling, and endless. Germanic tribes, sensing Rome's weakness, pushed across the Danube in waves. Marcus Aurelius spent the better part of the next decade living in a military camp, writing meditations by candlelight while the river froze and spears rattled in the dark. That's where his most famous work, Meditations, was written not in a study in Rome, but in tents on campaign. If you've ever read a quote like, "You have power over your mind, not outside events that came from a man with frost-bitten fingers who just watched half his legion get wiped out by barbarians." Marcus fought these wars not out of lust for conquest, but necessity. He pushed the invaders back, secured the borders, and tried to restore order, always with a mind to justice and morality. But even Stoics have blind spots, and Marcus Aurelius had one the size of a toga-wearing disaster his son. Commodus, born in 161 AD, the very year Marcus became emperor. Commodus was a prince from day one. He had the best tutors, the finest food, the softest cushions, and none of the hardship that had forged his father's iron self-discipline. By all accounts, Marcus adored him. Maybe too much. Despite centuries of tradition of emperors adopting the best men to rule after them, Marcus chose to break the chain. He named Commodus his heir by blood. Historians still debate why. Maybe it was paternal love. Maybe the plague had killed off too many better candidates. Maybe Marcus thought he could mold his son into a philosopher king like himself. He couldn't. When Marcus died in 180 AD, possibly from plague, possibly from exhaustion, Commodus ascended to the throne at just 18 years old. And Rome would never be the same. Let's be clear, Commodus was not just unfit to rule. He was unhinged. From the moment he took power, he began dismantling everything his father had built. He abandoned the Danube campaigns, signed treaties that emboldened the tribes, and rushed back to Rome to indulge himself in ways that would make Nero blush. He believed he was Hercules reincarnated. He wore lion skins and carried a club. He renamed Rome, Colonia Commodiana, the colony of Commodus. He renamed the months of the year after his own titles. He commissioned statues of himself dressed like a god, and then insisted people worship them. But his real passion, gladiatorial combat. Not watching it. Fighting in it. Yes, the Emperor of Rome would regularly step into the Colosseum and battle gladiators, wild animals, and condemned criminals. Of course, the contests were rigged. Commodus always won. His opponents were maimed, weak, or outright tied down. But the crowds were forced to cheer, and the Senate had to smile through clenched teeth as their emperor posed like a champion soaked in theatrical blood. He even charged Rome exorbitant fees for each appearance. "Pay me to be your god," he seemed to say. And behind the scenes, chaos. He executed senators for fun. He sold government offices to the highest bidder. He trusted astrologers, wrestlers, and shady advisors more than his generals. He married and discarded wives like robes. He accused his sister of plotting against him and had her murdered. Then he poisoned the man who carried out the murder. Then he executed the man who delivered the poison. You get the idea. Rome was spiraling. Eventually, even his closest allies had enough. On New Year's Eve, in 192 AD, his mistress Marcia slipped poison into his wine. When it didn't work fast enough, a wrestler named Narcissus, his personal trainer, was summoned. He strangled the emperor in his bath. And just like that, Commodus was gone, dead at 31. The people rejoiced. The Senate declared him a public enemy. Statues were torn down, his memory was cursed, and Rome once again found itself without a ruler. Another civil war loomed. But before we dive into that bloody mess, let's sit with Marcus Aurelius a moment longer. He wasn't flashy. He didn't parade. He didn't rename cities after himself or build golden statues. He wrote in notebooks. He thought deeply. He tried to govern well in an age of fire and plague. And in the end, his greatest flaw may have been the most human one of all. He loved his son too much, because Commodus, despite the lion skins and arena fanfare, left the empire weaker, darker, and more unstable than it had been in a century. The golden age of adoptive emperors was over. Now came a new storm. A marketplace assassination, an auctioned throne, and emperors who would barely last long enough to print coins with their names on them. The crisis was coming, and Rome Eternal, magnificent, fragile Rome was about to learn just how much damage one bad heir could do. When Commodus died on New Year's Eve in 192 AD, Rome blinked. Then, as if waking from a collective fever dream, it erupted into a flurry of relief celebration and, of course, chaos. The Senate immediately declared him a public enemy. Statues were smashed, names were erased from inscriptions, and everything that had been renamed Commodiana was urgently re-Commodused back into reality. The Colosseum, the months, the city itself. It was like a cosmic delete button had been pressed. But joy alone doesn't keep an empire running. Someone had to take over. Anyone. That someone, as it turned out, was an elderly senator named Pertinax. Publius Helvius Pertinax had once been a teacher, then a soldier, then a governor. He'd worked his way up from modest beginnings rare for Roman elites, and he had a reputation for being honest firm and maybe just a little too idealistic. When the assassins of Commodus approached him with the offer of the throne, Pertinax hesitated. But not for long. Rome needed a leader, and he perhaps foolishly believed he could guide it back to order. The Senate welcomed him, the people were cautiously optimistic, and Pertinax got to work. He slashed excessive spending, reinstated the senatorial dignity, reorganized the grain supply, cancelled ridiculous gladiator bonuses. Basically, he did all the things Commodus never would have dreamed of, let alone permitted. But there was a problem. The Praetorian Guard. These elite palace soldiers, the same ones who had helped kill Commodus, weren't exactly thrilled about having a no-nonsense schoolmaster as emperor. Especially not one who refused to bribe them. When they came to collect the traditional donativum, Pertinax offered them half of what they expected. He gave them a lecture on duty and virtue, and then crucially did not increase their pay. 3 months into his reign, a group of disgruntled guards stormed the palace. Pertinax tried to reason with them, calm them down. He offered to negotiate. They stabbed him in the courtyard. Thus ended the reign of Pertinax. 86 days. One reform-minded emperor. One very dead reform-minded emperor. And now, Rome faced a question so absurd it feels made up, except it's not. Who wants to buy the empire? Yes, that happened. The Praetorian Guard, realizing they held all the power, decided to auction the throne. They literally stood in their camp and asked the wealthy elite, "Who's the highest bidder?" 2 men stepped forward. One offered money and military reform. The other, a fabulously rich senator named Didius Julianus, offered more money. Guess who won? For a cool 25,000 sesterces per guard, enough to buy loyalty for about 10 minutes, the Praetorians declared Didius Julianus the new emperor. When the Senate heard, they went pale. The people rioted in the streets. Julianus, now emperor, tried to calm everyone down by throwing coins from balconies. It didn't work. Meanwhile, the real game had begun. Across the empire, governors and generals rose up, refusing to recognize this bribed buffoon. 3 major challenges emerged. Pescennius Niger, the governor of Syria, beloved by the Eastern legions. Clodius Albinus, commanding Britain. Septimius Severus, governor of Pannonia, commanding a fierce and disciplined army near the Danube. Severus moved first. He marched on Rome with terrifying speed. Julianus, with no loyal army and only the increasingly nervous Praetorian Guard to protect him, panicked. He tried to negotiate. He tried to offer co-emperorship. He tried to throw more money. It didn't matter. The Senate declared Severus emperor before he even reached the city. Julianus was executed in the palace garden, beheaded by a soldier who reportedly said, "This is what the empire costs. And so ended the auctioned reign of Emperor Didius Julianus, a lesson in just how low the purple could sink. Severus entered Rome unopposed. He disbanded the Praetorian Guard, entirely replaced them with loyal soldiers from the provinces, and established himself not just as emperor, but as the kind of emperor who would never ever let power slip again. And to ensure that he went to war, first he marched east and crushed Pescennius Niger in a brutal campaign that ended in Antioch. Then he turned west and dealt with Clodius Albinus, defeating him near Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, in a savage, bloody battle that left tens of thousands dead. But 197 AD Severus stood alone. He had clawed his way to power through sheer military force, and now that he had it, he wasn't letting go. The Severan dynasty had begun. Severus governed as a militarized emperor. He rewarded soldiers, lavishly raised their pay, and made military loyalty the new backbone of Roman rule. He ignored the Senate, dismissed critics, and elevated his own people, many of them of African and provincial origin, to top posts. Born in Leptis Magna, modern Libya, he was the first emperor from North Africa. He also had a family, 2 sons Caracalla and Geta, and we will talk about them. But first picture. Severus, stern, hawker-eyed, cloaked in armor, even at home. He believed in discipline, in tradition, in punishment. He built arches, expanded territories, strengthened borders, and cracked skulls when needed. His famous final advice to his sons: live in harmony, enrich the soldiers, scorn everyone else. Ah yes, what could possibly go wrong? Spoiler everything. When Severus died in 211 AD, while on campaign in Britain still waging war in his 60s, he left the empire to Caracalla and Geta jointly. He might as well have handed them swords and said, figure it out. The two despised each other. Bitter, jealous, and completely incompatible, they split the palace in half, kept separate staff, and refused to dine together. They were like twin volcanoes rumbling louder each week. Eventually, Caracalla offered a truce. Let's talk, he said, just us and our mother, Julia Domna. Geta agreed. He walked into the room. His mother stood between them. Caracalla's guards burst in and stabbed Geta to death in her arms. Her robes were soaked in blood. Caracalla wept crocodile tears for about a minute, then declared Geta a traitor, executed thousands of his supporters, and ordered his brother's image erased from every statue, coin, and document. Damnatio Memoriae again. Rome was getting good at it. Caracalla then spent the rest of his reign as a paranoid tyrant, endlessly touring provinces, avoiding Rome, and dreaming of being the next Alexander the Great. He built the Baths of Caracalla, some of the largest in Rome. He extended Roman citizenship to all free men in the empire, not for equality, but so he could tax more people. And in 217 AD, while relieving himself on the side of a road, Caracalla was assassinated by a disgruntled soldier. Just like that. Once again, Rome stood leaderless. The chaos loomed. But the Severan dynasty wasn't quite finished. Not yet. Because up next, a teenage priest from Syria, who wore makeup, married a Vestal virgin, and declared his sun god the one true deity. Yes, that's real. His name was Elagabalus, and his story makes Commodus look like a model of restraint. But for now, the streets are quiet again. The blood is being scrubbed from the tiles. The purple robe lies folded on a throne that seems more like a trap than a prize. Sleep comes slowly in Rome these days. You never know who's next. If the Roman Empire thought it had seen madness, it hadn't met Elagabalus yet. His real name was Virius Avitus Bassianus, but history remembers him best by the god he worshipped and arguably thought he was Elagabalus, the deity of the sun from the Syrian city of Emesa. Yes, Rome was about to be ruled by a teenage high priest of an Eastern solar cult. This was not going to be subtle. The story begins with his grandmother. Julia Maesa, the sister of the Empress Julia Domna Caracalla and Geta's mother, was as politically sharp as any general. After the assassination of Caracalla and the brief, forgettable reign of the Praetorian prefect, Macrinus Julia Maesa saw a power vacuum and filled it with her grandson. Elagabalus was just 14 when she dressed him in ceremonial robes, crowned him as the high priest of his native sun god, and convinced the Eastern legions that he was the illegitimate son of Caracalla. They bought it. In 218 AD, Elagabalus was declared emperor by the troops in Syria. He marched west under the banner of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, and Macrinus was swiftly defeated in battle, Rome was about to get the emperor it never asked for. From the moment he arrived, Elagabalus made waves, then tsunamis. He brought with him a black meteorite said to be the physical manifestation of his god and placed it in a grand new temple on the Palatine Hill. He declared his Syrian deity superior to Jupiter, Mars, and every other Roman god combined. This was blasphemous, bewildering, and to the Roman elite deeply offensive. But religion was only the beginning. Elagabalus blurred lines Rome didn't even know it had. He wore makeup and women's clothing. He requested to be addressed as lady instead of lord. He married and divorced multiple women, including a Vestal Virgin, a sacred priestess sworn to chastity under pain of death. That didn't stop him. Then came the rumors that he prostituted himself in the palace, that he built a private brothel and took customers, that he appointed lovers to high government positions, that he offered massive sums of money to any doctor who could perform a sex change operation. Historians still debate which of these are exaggerated and which are slander invented by disgusted senators. But whatever the truth, the image stuck a teenage sun priest defiling Roman traditions while dancing under golden parasols and draping his god statue in pearls. Even for Rome, this was a lot. The Praetorian Guard, originally amused, soon grew impatient. Elagabalus tried to shore up support by naming his cousin Alexander Severus as co-heir. It was a move orchestrated, of course, by his grandmother Julia Maesa, who had realized, as many Roman matriarchs eventually did, that her grandson was more liability than legacy. Then Elagabalus made his final mistake. He changed his mind. He tried to have Alexander assassinated. The guard, fiercely protective of the younger cousin, refused. Elagabalus panicked. He stripped Alexander of his titles. The guard muttered darkly. Rome waited. And in 222 AD it happened. Elagabalus and his mother were murdered by members of the Praetorian Guard. Their bodies were dragged through the streets. He was just 18. The black meteorite was returned to Syria. His name was scrubbed from records, his statues torn down, his memory damned. Rome had learned a lesson, maybe. And into this vacuum stepped a boy of just 13, Alexander Severus. Now, by all accounts, Alexander was the exact opposite of his cousin. Where Elagabalus was wild and unpredictable, Alexander was thoughtful and serious. He studied philosophy. He listened to advisors. He actually tried to govern. Of course, most of the governing was done by his mother, Julia Mamaea, and a council of learned men she surrounded herself with. But Alexander gave the empire something it hadn't had in years: stability. He reformed the legal system, reduced taxes, negotiated peace where possible. Soldiers respected him. Senators sighed in relief. For a while it worked. But there was a storm building beyond the frontiers. In 235 AD, Germanic tribes pushed across the Rhine. Alexander, reluctant to rush into war, tried to buy peace. The army, hardened and eager for glory, was disgusted. They wanted a fighter. They wanted action. They wanted Maximinus Thrax. Maximinus was everything Alexander wasn't. A giant of a man over 8 feet tall by some accounts. Born a Thracian shepherd, a commoner who rose through the ranks with his fists and a terrifying scowl. He despised elites. He despised cities. And the soldiers adored him. One night they declared Maximinus emperor. And Alexander, he and his mother were murdered in their tent. Just like that, the Severan dynasty ended in silence. With Maximinus Thrax, the empire entered what historians now call the crisis of the 3rd century, a 50-year plunge into chaos, civil war, economic collapse, barbarian invasions, and emperor turnover so fast it felt like Rome was speedrunning its own downfall. In just one generation, over 20 emperors would rise and fall, most murdered by their own troops. Let that sink in. Maximinus himself ruled for 3 years, never once setting foot in Rome before being assassinated by his own mutinous soldiers outside Aquileia. Then came a parade of names, Gordian Narman II, who both died within weeks. Balbinus and Pupienus murdered in the palace. Philip the Arab, who celebrated Rome's 1000th birthday in a lavish festival, and was then killed in battle. And then Decius. Decius Traianus, proclaimed emperor by his troops, tried to bring back old Roman values. With a particularly harsh twist, he initiated one of the most intense persecutions of Christians in Roman history. But the gods were silent. The Goths invaded. Plague returned. and in 251 AD Decius died in battle, his body lost in the swamps of the Balkans. After him came Valerian, captured by the Persians, humiliated, and allegedly used as a human footstool before being skinned and displayed as a warning. It would be decades before Rome found any kind of stability again. But let's return briefly to Elagabalus, that meteor-chosen teenager who believed the sun spoke through him. He was not a good emperor. But his story in all its surreal, glittering mess reminds us how deeply Rome could swing from stoic philosophers in armor to painted priests in silk. Rome endured all of it. Because Rome wasn't built on sanity, it was built on spectacle. And Elagabalus, he was the opening act in an imperial circus that was just getting warmed up. The sun had set on him. But behind the curtain, emperors were still waiting. Some wore laurel wreaths, others wore helmets. All of them thought they could hold the empire together. None of them saw how fast it was unraveling. The 3rd century in Rome didn't feel like history. It felt like whiplash. The empire was still enormous, stretching from the misty coast of Britannia to the deserts of Arabia. But the foundations had begun to crack. And with each emperor who tried to hold it all together, the cracks grew deeper. We are now in the era historians call the Chrysopodepa crisis of the 3rd century. Though honestly, crisis might be underselling it. Between 235 and 284 AD, Rome had more than 20 emperors. Some ruling for mere weeks, others dying before they could even print coins. Most were proclaimed by the army. Most died by the sword. Let's pick up with Gallienus, who ruled during what can only be described as the empire's nervous breakdown. Gallienus was the son of Emperor Valerian. The same Valerian who marched east to fight the Persians was captured in battle by King Shapurtwers and became, if ancient sources are to be believed, a living footstool for the Persian king until his death. His skin was allegedly flayed and dyed red, stuffed with straw, and displayed in a temple, so Gallienus ruled alone. He wasn't a bad emperor, really. He passed progressive reforms, elevated more equestrian class officers, and even banned senators from military command, which infuriated the old elite, but probably saved the army from further chaos. He supported the arts. He tried genuinely to hold it all together. But the empire was falling apart faster than he could patch the seams. Barbarian invasions poured across the Rhine and Danube. Plague and famine decimated the countryside. Provinces began breaking off. In Gaul, a general named Postumus formed his own splinter empire, the so-called Gallic Empire, with its own emperors, legions, and bureaucracy. In the east, Queen Zenobia of Palmyra took control of Syria and Egypt, styling herself Augusta and ruling in the name of her young son. Rome wasn't just divided, it was dismembered. Meanwhile, back in the capital, conspiracies bloomed like mold. Gallienus faced rebellion after rebellion. Every time he left to fight one usurper, 2 more declared themselves emperor. It became almost comical. In 1 year, no fewer than 5 men claimed the throne, simultaneously each backed by some corner of the army, convinced they'd found their savior. Gallienus somehow survived longer than most, 15 years, before finally being assassinated in 268 AD by his own commanders during the siege of Milan. Another one down. And then came Claudius Gothicus. Yes, that's really what he was called. And no, he wasn't a moody German in a black leather cape. He earned the title by crushing a massive Gothic invasion at the Battle of Naissus. It was one of Rome's most decisive victories in decades, and for a fleeting moment it felt like the empire might have a fighting chance. Claudius ruled with energy and ambition, but his time was brief. He died of plague just 2 years into his reign. Another potential savior lost to pestilence. Now enter Aurelian. If you want to imagine Aurelian, picture a man forged from sheer grit and battlefield sweat. He rose through the ranks as a cavalry commander known for his speed, discipline, and absolutely no tolerance for nonsense. His soldiers adored him. His enemies did not. When he became emperor in 270 AD, the empire was in pieces, literally. The West was under the Gallic Empire. The East was ruled by Zenobia's Palmyrene Empire. The borders were under siege. The economy was in free fall. The sun was still rising, but Rome was bleeding. Aurelian didn't waste time. In 5 years, he reconquered the entire empire. First, he marched east and confronted Zenobia. She was no pushover. Educated in Greek and Latin, descended according to her own propaganda from Cleopatra. And Dido Zenobia ruled Palmyra with brilliance. She issued coins in her own name. She led troops in person. She took Alexandria. But she couldn't match Aurelian's military might. He crushed her forces at the Battle of Emesa besieged Palmyra and captured Zenobia while she tried to flee across the desert on a camel. She was paraded through Rome in golden chains during Aurelian's triumph, and then possibly retired in a villa. With the east restored, Aurelian turned west. He invaded the Gallic Empire, defeated their final emperor, and reintegrated the rebellious provinces. In just 5 years, Aurelian had stitched the empire back together. He even reformed the coinage, tried to tackle inflation, started rebuilding the city's defenses with the Aurelian walls, many of which still stand today. Rome for a flickering moment felt whole. And then, like so many before him, Aurelian died not in battle, not in bed, but stabbed to death by his own officers. After a forged document tricked them into thinking they were marked for execution, Rome couldn't even keep a good emperor alive long enough to say, "I told you so." A few more short-lived emperors followed Tacitus, Probus Carus, and his sons Carinus and Numerian, each leaving a smudge on the timeline, none able to break the cycle. Then came Diocletian, and everything changed. When Diocletian seized power in 284 AD, he understood that Rome wasn't just cracking, it was breaking. The empire had become too big, too chaotic, too unstable for one man to rule alone. And so he did something no emperor before him had dared. He split the empire. Not into 2, but into 4. This was the Tetrarchy ruled by 4. 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars, each ruling a quarter of the empire. It was clean, it was logical, it was pure Diocletian. He took the eastern half and appointed Maximian as co-Augustus in the west. Each Augustus appointed a Caesar Galerius and Constantius respectively. Together, they administered, defended, and restructured an empire that had been held together with spit and superstition. Diocletian reorganized the provinces, increased the number of administrators, created mobile field armies, reformed taxation, standardized currency. And then he turned his attention to religion. The Christians. They had grown from obscure sect to organized stubborn community. They refused to offer sacrifices to the emperor. They met in secret. They spread like wildfire. And to Diocletian, they threatened the sacred fabric of Roman unity. So he launched the Great Persecution. Churches were destroyed, scriptures were burned, bishops were arrested, torture and execution swept across the empire. It was the largest, bloodiest, state-sponsored persecution of Christians in Roman history. But it failed. The faith endured. The martyrs multiplied. And just a few decades later, the Christian cross would be sewn into the banners of Roman legions. In 305 AD, something almost unimaginable happened. Diocletian retired. He built a palace in what is now Croatia. He gardened. He watched the empire from afar. When asked to return to power, he declined. Legend says he pointed to his cabbage patch and said, "If you had seen what I've grown, you wouldn't ask me to rule again." A soft ending for a hard man. But the Tetrarchy didn't hold. As soon as Diocletian stepped down, the successors began squabbling. Civil war erupted again. Too many emperors, too many ambitions. One of those ambitious men, Constantine. But that's a tale for the next part. For now rest beneath the shadow of Rome's new walls. They are thicker, higher, built for the world to come. Inside them, emperors still play their dangerous game. Outside, the world shifts, and no one, not even Diocletian, with all his plans, can stop the future from arriving. From the smoking wreckage of the Tetrarchy, one name rose above the others, carried not just by ambition, but by something altogether rarer in Roman history vision. Constantine. Flavius Valerius Constantinus, to use his full name, was born in 272 AD in what is now Serbia. His father was Constantius Chlorus, one of the original Caesars appointed under Diocletian's great four-man system. His mother was Helena, a woman of humble origins, later canonized as a saint, Constantine grew up in military camps and imperial courts, absorbing the language of power while sharpening his sword. When Diocletian and Maximian abdicated in 305 AD, the tetrarchy so carefully designed did what all Roman power-sharing schemes eventually did. It imploded. New Caesars were appointed. Rivalries flared. The empire once again began to fracture into pieces as claimants jostled for position like gladiators circling each other with bloody eyes. Constantine was stationed in Britain when his father died in 306 AD. The army, as armies often did, proclaimed the son as successor on the spot. There was no senate, no ceremony, just shields, swords, and shouts of loyalty. The problem, there were now multiple emperors, all declared by different armies, different cities, different bureaucrats. Rome was once again in a civil war. Over the next 6 years, Constantine navigated this chaos like a man balancing on a blade. He forged uneasy alliances, fought strategic battles, and eliminated rivals one by one. But the true turning point, the moment where myth and history begin to blur, came in the year 312 AD. On the eve of the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, his enemy was Maxentius, another would-be emperor who held Rome and the loyalty of the Praetorian Guard. Constantine was outnumbered. The city gates were closed to him. And then the sky changed. According to Christian sources, Constantine looked up and saw a vision, a cross of light above the sun, and words that shimmered like fire in the clouds. In this sign conquer. The next night, Christ appeared to him in a dream, instructing him to mark his soldiers' shields with the Chi-Rho, 2 Greek letters, and Orst Chrekin, the first 2 letters of Christ. So he did. When dawn broke, Constantine's army bore strange new symbols. The soldiers marched under a banner called the Labarum, not with the eagles of Jupiter, but with the emblem of a crucified Messiah. They won. Maxentius was drowned in the Tiber. Constantine entered Rome as its sole ruler in the West. The Senate declared him Augustus, and something had fundamentally changed. Whether you believe the vision was divine, political, or invented later by clever chroniclers, one fact remains. Constantine became the first Christian emperor, and the world would never be the same. In 313 AD, alongside his eastern co-emperor, Licinius, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, granting religious toleration to all faiths, including Christianity. The era of persecution of lions in the Colosseum and underground churches in catacombs was officially over. But Constantine didn't stop at tolerance. He began to favor the church. He returned confiscated properties. He funded the construction of basilicas. He exempted clergy from taxes. He held councils to settle theological disputes, most famously the Council of Nicaea. In 325 AD, where bishops hammered out the Nicene Creed, that foundational summary of Christian belief still resided today. Constantine didn't convert overnight. He continued to issue coins with pagan symbols. He didn't get baptized until his deathbed. But his direction was clear. He was aligning the empire with a faith that had once been hunted like wolves in the woods. Meanwhile, he had more mundane concerns like reuniting the empire under his rule. In 324 AD, Constantine defeated Licinius in a series of battles, becoming the sole emperor of Rome, East and West, for the first time in decades. Now he had another vision. Rome, the city of 7 hills, was beautiful, yes, but politically unstable, clogged with senatorial baggage, and increasingly vulnerable to barbarian threats. Constantine wanted a fresh start, so he turned east, to an old Greek city on the Bosporus, Byzantium. He rebuilt it from the ground up, adorning it with forums, palaces, aqueducts, and churches. He called it Nova Roma. New Rome, but it quickly took on a different name. Constantinople. It became the heart of the Eastern Roman Empire, a city of domes, mosaics, marble, and minarets. It would stand for over 1,000 years long after the Western Empire collapsed into dust. Rome, it turns out, had been reborn. But not everything Constantine touched turned to gold. He was ruthless with rivals. He ordered the execution of his eldest son, Crispus. Under murky circumstances, he later had his wife, Fausta, suffocated in a steam bath. Some say it was political intrigue, others whisper of false accusations and terrible regrets. We'll never know the full truth. What we do know is that Constantine died in 337 AD. After a long illness, baptized at last, and buried in the Church of the Holy Apostles in Constantinople, surrounded by 12 empty tombs, one for each apostle, with the emperor himself as Christ stand-in. Subtle he was not. With his death, the empire was divided among his 3 surviving sons, Constantine II, Constans, and Constantius Set, who quickly resumed the family tradition of civil war, betrayal, and fratricide. But that's a different story. Tonight, let us pause. Let's sit with the image of a Constantine standing by the Milvian Bridge, eyes lifted to the sky. A man who saw or claimed to see a sign, a cross that would change everything. He didn't just save the empire. He redirected it. He gave Christianity the keys to the imperial palace. He gave the East a new capital. He gave the church legitimacy and the sword of state behind it. And whether you see him as Saint Shrewd politician or both, there's no denying this. The old gods were dying. The age of Jupiter, Mars, and Venus was ending. And from the ashes of their temples, a carpenter's son from Nazareth had risen to take their place. Rome had a new faith, and soon it would have new enemies. The frontier still burned. The tribes still watched. The West would falter. The East would endure. But for now, the eagle standard had found a new shadow to fly beneath. The empire still stood, for a little while longer. When Constantine's body was laid to rest beneath the gilded arches of the Church of the Holy Apostles in 337 AD, Rome may have lost an emperor, but the world had gained a legend. His sons, Constantine II, Constantius II, and Constans, divided the empire like slices of a too-hot pie and predictably burned themselves. The unity their father had fought and bled for didn't even outlast his funeral. Within 3 years, Constantine II tried to grab more land, invaded his brother's territory, and was ambushed and killed. The West fell to Constans, the East to Constantius III. The empire was split again, and the cycle of fraternal backstabbing rolled on like a chariot with no brakes. But something else had shifted, something deeper. The Roman world was no longer just Roman. It was Christian Roman. Constantine hadn't just legalized Christianity, he'd entwined it with power. Bishops now advised emperors. Doctrines were debated in imperial councils. Heretics were exiled by edict. The cross wasn't just in churches, it was on banners, coins, and shields. And that posed a new problem. What exactly did Christianity mean? Enter the 4th century's favorite blood sport, or theological warfare. The Nicene Creed was meant to end the debates. It didn't. Instead, argument over the nature of Christ, was he fully divine subordinate to God, the Father of the same substance, or just a celestial hype man, sparked riotous brawls in the streets of Alexandria and Antioch. Monks fought with furniture, bishops slapped each other, emperors took sides. Constantine's son, Constantius II, leaned toward the Arian side of the debate, which denied Christ's full divinity. He convened councils. He exiled Nicene bishops. He generally made a theological mess while trying to keep his hands clean. Amid all this, barbarians pressed harder at the borders, particularly one very big and very angry group, the Goths. The Gothic tribes were restless, hungry, and increasingly powerful. They lived beyond the Danube, watching the empire's slow motion unravel, like wolves circling an aging lion. Then came that Julian the Apostate, as Christian historians would later call him. He was the nephew of Constantine, a bookish philosopher, with a beard, a deep love of classical paganism, and absolutely zero interest in towing the Christian imperial line. In 361 AD, after a string of civil wars and internal purges, Julian emerged as emperor, and he immediately shocked everyone by announcing that he was not Christian. In fact, he was determined to bring back the old gods. Temples were reopened, sacrifices were reinstated, pagan philosophy re-entered favor. Julian saw Christianity as a spiritual monoculture, choking Rome's soul. He wanted pluralism, debate, ritual poetry. He wanted to roll back time. It didn't work. He ruled for just 2 years before being killed during a military campaign against the Persians. No heir, no continuity. His pagan revival fizzled the moment he stopped breathing. The church, vindicated and vengeful, promptly labeled him the apostate, a traitor to the faith. With Julian dead, Christianity reasserted itself with renewed ferocity. By the time Theodosius the Perters came to power in 379 AD, the gloves were off. Theodosius was devout, stern, effective, and he was the emperor who made Nicene Christianity the official religion of the Roman Empire. No more tolerance, no more ambiguity. He outlawed pagan sacrifices, closed temples, banned the Olympic Games, which had run continuously since 776 BC. He exiled heretical bishops and dismantled pagan statues. The Serapeum of Alexandria, a towering ancient temple to the god Serapis, was destroyed by a Christian mob. This was no longer the old Rome. It was something new, and as Christianity rose, the Western Empire faltered. The East, governed from Constantinople, was thriving, wealthy, urbanized, well-defended. The West, not so much. Rome was hollowing out. The Senate was irrelevant. The army was underpaid. The fields were abandoned. And the barbarians, they'd stopped waiting. In 376 AD, a wave of Lepore Gothic refugees, he begged to enter the empire, fleeing from the rampaging Huns of Central Asia. Emperor Valens, ruler of the East, agreed, hoping to settle them in the Balkans as loyal farmers and soldiers. It did not go well. The Roman officials tasked with their care extorted, starved, and abused the Goths. Resentment boiled over into open revolt. In 378 AD, at the Battle of Adrianople, Valens marched out with a full Roman field army to crush the rebellion. He was annihilated. 2/3 of the army was slaughtered. Valens himself died on the field, or perhaps burned alive in a barn surrounded by enemies. No emperor had fallen in battle since Decius over a century earlier. It was a seismic blow. The empire never fully recovered. In the years that followed, Gothic leaders like Alaric would roam through the empire with near impunity. Rome signed treaties, paid bribes, and made promises. The Goths accepted citizenship, then revolted again, over and over. Then in 410 AD, something unthinkable happened. Rome was sacked. By the Visigoths, by Alaric. The Eternal City, untouched by foreign armies for over 800 years, was plundered, looted, violated. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem, wrote, "If Rome can perish, what can be safe?" It shook the ancient world. The Western Empire staggered on for a few more decades, ruled by ever weaker emperors propped up by Germanic generals. The Senate still met, issuing toothless decrees. Coins were still stamped, but the soul had fled the body. And in 476 it ended. A Germanic warlord named Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, a teenager with a grand name and no army. Odoacer didn't bother taking the title of emperor himself. He sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople with a note, "No need for a new one, we've got this." And just like that, the Western Roman Empire was gone. No final battle, no grand funeral, just a whimper, a shrug, and a bureaucratic footnote. But the East lived on. The Byzantine Empire, as we now call it, would carry the torch of Rome for another 1,000 years. Its emperors still called themselves Romans. Its laws were Roman. Its language eventually Greek, but its identity remained imperial, its capital a city Constantine had built from marble and prophecy. As the western palaces crumbled into ruins, Constantinople still glittered. Domes rose, crosses shone, and in the distance new empires stirred. The sands of Arabia would soon whisper of a prophet. The steppes would churn with horsemen. The north would launch longboats. But for now, the world turned under stars that had once shone down on Jupiter and Mars, and now glowed above cathedrals, relics, and sacred texts. Rome was dead. Rome was reborn, and in every corner of Europe the memory of emperors lingered in roads, in ruins, in laws, and in dreams. Dreams of empire, dreams of power, dreams of immortality. And tonight, as you drift between sleep and thought, perhaps you can hear them. The echo of sandals in marble halls, the whisper of silk behind a throne, and the voice of a man, just a man, saying, "What an artist dies in me." Because emperors, for all their crowns and titles, were human too, mortal, messy, mad, and unforgettable. And so we come to the final stretch of this long, strange, blood-splattered road, the twilight hours of the emperors, when shadows grew longer, crowns sat heavier, and the idea of Rome became both more fragile and more mythic. Because by the time the last Western emperor was deposed in 476 AD, the word emperor no longer meant what it used to. The title still shimmered with the illusion of power, but beneath the purple robes was often a puppet, a child, or a ghost. Let's step back for a moment. For over 500 years, the Roman Empire had been ruled by a single man with the power of a god, or so the propaganda would have you believe. From Augustus to Constantine, from Nero to Diocletian, these emperors shaped the world with whims, decrees, and in some cases, actual musical performances. But now we were in the era of broken puppets and barbarian kings. After the sack of Rome in 410 AD, the empire had tried to stitch itself back together. For a time, the general Stilicho Dursobeturwa held things together with battlefield grit. Then came Aetius Atude, who, for all his faults, managed to push back Attila the Hun, the Honda at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. In 451, a brief shining moment of resistance against the darkness creeping across the borders. Attila, by the way, didn't die in glorious combat. He died on his wedding night of a nosebleed. History's sense of irony, it seems, was still alive and well. Meanwhile, emperors came and went like seasonal fruit. Valentinian III stabbed Aetius in the palace, only to be murdered himself by Aetius's followers. Petronius Maximus took the throne, then fled as those Vandals, sacked Rome in 455, only to be killed by an angry mob while trying to escape the city in a crowd. The Vandals, yes, the ones we now use as shorthand for rowdy teenagers, did more than steal silver. They captured the Empress Licinia Eudoxia and her daughters, one of whom later married the Vandal king. Rome's enemies weren't just invading anymore. They were marrying and yet the emperors kept appearing. Sometimes real men, sometimes figureheads placed there by barbarian generals like Ricimer, who played Roman politics like a child rearranging toy soldiers. He made and unmade emperors like set pieces in a shadow play. By 475, the Western Empire had been reduced to a stub of Italy, with its once proud capital shuffled off to the city of Ravenna, a marshy fortress surrounded by swamps, canals, and gloom. It was there that the final emperor was crowned, Romulus Augustulus. He was maybe 14 years old. The irony was rich. Romulus, named after Rome's mythical founder. Augustulus, little Augustus, a diminutive of the name of its greatest emperor. The beginning and the end stitched together in one unfortunate teenager. He was placed on the throne by his father Orestes, who had once served under Attila the Hun, but within a year, a new power rose. Odoacer. A Germanic general tired of pretending. He marched on Ravenna, captured the city, and forced Romulus to abdicate. No bloodshed, no siege, just surrender. Romulus was spared, sent to live in comfort on a small estate in Campania with a generous pension. It was one of the kindest fates any emperor had received in centuries. And so in 476 AD, the Western Roman Empire came to an end not with a glorious last stand, but with a retirement package. But what does it mean to say that Rome fell? Because that same year, in the eastern capital of Constantinople, another emperor, Zeno, was still ruling. The Roman Empire still had roads, cities, legions, coins. Latin was still spoken in law courts. Senators still held office. Only now the West belonged to warlords. And the East became something else, something Byzantine. The emperors in Constantinople continued to call themselves Roman for nearly 1,000 years. They wore silk instead of togas. They prayed in Greek instead of Latin. Their icons glowed with gold. Their palaces shone with mosaics. But their laws, their bureaucracy, their dreams, those were Roman. And in that distant imperial court, the memory of Julius Caesar still lingered. Let's visit one final emperor, one who came long after the fall of Rome, and yet ruled its legacy. Justinian was crowned in 527 AD. He ruled over what historians call the Byzantine Golden Age. From Constantinople, he launched wars to reclaim lost western lands, temporarily restoring Roman rule to parts of North Africa, Italy, and Spain. His general, Belisarius, was a military genius who reconquered vast swaths of territory and then lived just long enough to be betrayed, blinded, and maybe restored. Justinian did more than fight. He codified Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, or body of civil law, was compiled under his watch and would go on to form the basis of legal systems across Europe for centuries. Even today, echoes of it live in your legal contracts, your constitutions, your courtroom arguments. And if you ever walk into the Hagia Sophia, his greatest architectural masterpiece, you'll still feel the presence of an emperor who dreamed of divine order beneath a golden dome. But Justinian's world wasn't invincible. His reign saw the Plague of Justinian, which killed millions. Earthquakes shook the cities, riots tore through Constantinople, and eventually even the reconquered lands slipped away again like sand through imperial fingers. Yet somehow the idea of Rome endured, even after the Western throne sat empty. Even after Gothic kings ruled Italy, Arab armies swept across Syria and Egypt, and Viking raiders breached the coasts. Even after the Ottomans took Constantinople in 1453, ending the last vestige of the Roman line, something remained. The idea that an emperor, one man, could hold the fate of the world in his hands. That power could be beautiful, terrifying, sacred, and doomed all at once. That Rome, with all its cruelty and brilliance, never truly died. It simply became a story, told again and again, in cathedrals, in law books, in dreams, and now perhaps in your dreams too. Close your eyes. The marble halls have quieted. The torches have burned low. The emperors, mad, brilliant, brutal, have faded into shadows, their sandals silent against the stone. But you remember them. Because how could you not? They were not gods. They were men. And what men they were. Tonight we followed the long and winding path through the lives of the Roman emperors, from Augustus, the quiet tactician who ended the Republic, to Constantine, who raised the cross over an empire, to Romulus Augustulus, the teenage emperor who quietly surrendered it all. Along the way we met monsters and philosophers, generals and dreamers. We walked through palaces and battlefields, past soaring triumphal arches, and through silent ruins. Some emperors ruled with wisdom and restraint. Others burned cities, betrayed their families, or declared their horses to be priests. The empire fell, and then it didn't. It broke, then reinvented itself. What began in the Senate halls of Rome echoed through Constantinople, whispered through monasteries, and still echoes today in marble columns and modern law. The emperors remind us that absolute power is a dangerous and deeply human thing. That greatness often shares a bed with madness, that the rise and fall of civilizations are as much about personalities as policies. And in the end, what they left behind wasn't just an empire, but a legend. So rest now, dear listener. You've walked with emperors tonight. You've wandered through time. May your dreams be calm, your mind at peace, and may the gods of old, if they still linger, watch over your sleep with silent eyes.